So let's say you've formed the hair, you're happy with the shape of the horse's mane, you've adjusted all your sliders and your settings, added the appropriate modifiers. But just like with the feathers, we did all the work, and then when it came to rendering, we then had more work to do. So let's just check how the horse is looking before we proceed by doing a quick render. So click render. Let's just see how he's looking. Okay, so first of all, the mane is white and we want it to be black. So that's easily fixed through the shader. But the length of the mane is completely different to what we're seeing in the viewport. As we can see here, it sort of cuts off. It's almost like he's had a haircut in translation. So what can we do? I mean, the lengths are all fine in here, but they're just not translating correctly. So what we need to do now is go into our preview options. If you go to output settings here, we can see that this is where it's set up, how you specify how it's rendering. And you can, the operation, basically we want it to render, which is fine, but you can also set it to output the guides, a MEL file, a particle file, all sorts of other things. And the renderer is mental ray. Now it won't render with anything else, so you have to have your renderer set to mental ray. But the interesting part, which is affecting the mane, is this primitive bound here. And as you can see, it's popping up with some helpful information. What this is going to do is basically put a bounding box around the mane and clip off anything within this value. And at the moment, 1 is clipping it just up here. So what we need to do, rather than trying to guess what value it is, we can click Auto Set. As we can see, that's jumped up to 51. So let's just render, and let's just see if that's fixed it for us. And there we go. So the horse's mane is now as long as it is in the viewport, just by checking that setting. So now on to the next problem, and the horse's mane being black. So let's being white, and we want it to be black. So let's go into our hypershade. And remember, I'm just doing basic renders here using the default light. There's nothing fancy going on, there's no ambient occlusion or anything. These are just very basic renders. So we have our feather material, which is fine. But down here we have this hair fong. And this is what is used to set up the hair in the scene. So I'll minimize that. Now this shader is pretty much just like a dummy shader. As you can see, it has attributes of color, ambience, and the specular, but they're all already connected to something else. So if we click on that, we'll see that they're connected to this node, which is this one that's sat next to here. And this is the node that you want to play around with when you're adjusting your shaders. Now we're not going to get too involved in rendering at this stage. What we might do later on in the course, when the fur and everything is done, is just briefly go over just setting up a quick render. But for now, we know that we want the fur to be darker, so we can adjust the diffuse color here, drop it right down, and then we have other options like our specular color, the back color, and a second specular color. So let's just see what it's looking like just by making that diffuse color black or very dark. So that's working already, but there's still quite a lot of specularity in there. So we know that that's coming from this. So we can make this a higher value, which will make the specular color tighter, and we can drop this down maybe to a grey color instead. So that's looking better already. But the mane is looking a bit scraggly, so we could maybe increase the density as well. So let's go back to our XGen window, go back to primitives. Now if I increase the density in here, it's going to update in here as well and possibly slow down the preview as you're working. So what I would suggest doing is in here in preview settings, drop down your percentage to 50%. If I just drop that, like so, let's just put that back to 100. And as you can see, it's updated in here. So what this is going to say is in the viewport, only show 50% of the primitives that are specified in here. So now we can double that density and we're getting back to what we had before, except when we render, there should be twice as much fur. So let's just save this. Twice as much hair, sorry. So that's looking thicker, as you can see, as I flip between the two. Now it's looking a bit grainy, but again, we're just doing a very basic render here. We're not adjusting any fancy settings or anything. We're just trying to get a general idea of how the mane is going to look. I mean, we could make it longer, and now we can see it in here. The ends could maybe taper a little bit more, or we could go back in and just play around a bit more with that shader there. So double click on that. We could maybe add a bit more of a specular highlight. So this was affecting the, so we'll set that to 30. Let's make that 20. Create another render. So there we're just, you can just pick out where it's just picking up the lights here. But until we get some proper lights in the scene, there's no point in playing around too much with the shaders at this stage. Basically, what we're after is something in the viewport so that we can do a quick render, check that the forms and the shapes are looking okay before we then move on to the next part. Once we've done the tail, we'll move on to the fur for the body, and then finally we'll add some basic lights into the scene and just start to look at balancing out those shaders and other bits. So I think that's it for the mane. We will leave it here, and again you can just play around with those a little bit more, experiment with some of the modifiers, get the sort of shape that you're after. And in the next video we're just going to do exactly the same, but this time we're going to add the tail.